Hey guys, my name's Kane.
I'm Adam.
And we make hammerhead holders. To Pete's point about concentrating innovation, Adam and I actually started trying to reinvent bicycles, their distribution, their manufacturing, and it turns out that's really hard. Like Pete said, they're focusing on a specific component and they use a lot of suppliers or specific software. Where we decided to focus is on the distribution and the manufacturing. If you're unfamiliar or you haven't purchased a bicycle recently, the price is basically monotonically increased year on year, or the average price, over the past about 20 years. And the reason for that is that it becomes more and more performance-oriented, more doodly every year. And that becomes a self-replicating cycle. And so, what we wanted to do is just hit a hard reset, really break down the bike to its components and raw materials, and start a brand from zero focused on cycling rather than the bike as a fetish object.
And as we got into that, if you go into a bike shop, there are bikes at every conceivable price point of every conceivable configuration. And so, to a lot of people, it looks like a crowded market, and it is crowded. But what we realized that there was within a market that had all of these options, there was still room for a value play. So you could either be more like a better deal going direct than some of the more traditional distributions, or you could provide higher quality than basically mass market brands. And so that's just to say that you shouldn't look at a price ladder and just say there's no space for me in this.
And where that space is created is in the distribution. And so right now, if you were to walk into a bike store and buy a bike, you're buying a bike that has a brand, it's called Acme Bicycles. That brand has contracted manufacturing about 18 months ago from an Asian supplier, most likely in Taiwan, if they're high quality, or China if they're lower quality. And about 6 or 12 months ago, they've put those bikes on a container and sent them to mom and pop retailers throughout the United States. What this results in is really low resolution tracking, a lot of turnover of inventory, and really slow feedback about what sells and what doesn't sell. So year on year, they're making decisions with very little information, and all that risk gets priced back into the bicycle.
And I think Kane sort of went quickly through the big point, which is a lot of people see this and say, great, you're going direct to consumer. A lot of people do that. And that's definitely part of it. And you get savings because you just have fewer people taking the markup. But the other nuance, as Kane was saying, is they have to plan so far in advance with so little information, and they have to commit to inventory and commit to working capital, that when they produce the wrong size, color, model, and they're sitting in the store for 6 months, and then they have to clear it to inventory for cash, all of that waste is actually baked into the price of the one bike that the consumer does buy. So every consumer is essentially buying the bike that they want, and then the bike at the end of the season that's going to be sold at markdown because of these long leads. This is like, Kane pulled this from our website, like this is a simple story, but there is a lot more nuance to collapsing the supply chain and the value you get out of it.
And if you guys are interested in the details, find us afterwards. That's just to provide the quick context for what we want to talk about today, which is sustainable, accurate, and replicatable manufacturing. So this is actually a facility in Taiwan. It's in a wind-powered region right next to the port of Taichung, which makes it really efficient to go from manufacturing to port to our distribution centers. And so what we're going to talk about today is actually the manufacturing lessons that we've learned over the past year and a half, going from zero to small scale. It can actually be summed up in one sentence, which is don't trust your suppliers. And there's 3 reasons why you shouldn't trust your suppliers. The first one is malice. Hopefully you never run into a malicious supplier, but you just can't be too paranoid. The second one is more innocuous. It's just simple negligence, like this picture here, where they're not intentionally trying to hurt you, but they have other clients. They also want to get home, so you really want to catch the negligence. And then the third one is simple misunderstanding. So we're selling direct. Most bike suppliers sell to distributors and then retailers who do teching and mechanical work along the way. So when we say we want a bike that's good enough out of the box, they interpret that as something different.
Yeah, and I think one thing we learned was every time we thought we understood the supply chain, we're like, great, we got it end to end. couple months later, you'd learn a bunch of nuances that at the time weren't obvious, and it wasn't obvious that the supplier should have told you about it. But they just don't have the perspective that you just wouldn't know that, or you wouldn't know, in our case, that a part got air freighted, and that the next time we ordered it, it was going to be on the water for 30 days, and they forgot to point it out to us, and so our timeline was now bumped by 30 days. And so, as Kane was saying, that's not malice, but they're not used to teaching people from the ground up that haven't been doing this whatever the manufacturing is for 20 or 30 years. So you have to ask a lot of questions, and you have to, I think we found that to be one really effective thing is to summarize and put it on paper or put it in Excel or put it in a timeline, and that's when you'll really see like, oh no, this window is different, or this doesn't add up.
And culturally too, so we're selling direct, and it's very important for us to invest in that box, the box we ship in. And it literally took weeks to convince our supplier that yes, we were going to pay for a full color print. And they kept trying to change our minds, and they just didn't get why we would overinvest in a box like that. So if you're ever at the point where you're doing something and you think, oh, the supplier's got it, you stop yourself and write it down, put it in writing, so at least when they mess it up, you can point to the writing and get some of your money back. So a few tactical ways to implement these checks against your supplier. The first one is always visit your supplier when you can. And this seems simple and straightforward, but you'd be amazed by what suppliers will try to get away with if you're not visiting. So we work in Taiwan because we manufacture higher quality bikes, and the working standards are pretty acceptable up to ISO standards, but we visited Chinese factories where they're welding without masks, they're welding with like plastic sunglasses, they're using foot pedals to pulse the thing, and there's no way to know that unless you visit. They might say like, yeah, we weld using these materials, but the small details, like, is the guy wearing an actual welding mask? That's all unknown until you visit.
I think the other thing is just having meals with your suppliers, developing personal relationships so that they care. Early on, you're probably going to be a very small and inconsequential customer. We had a supplier that was really proud of the local bananas, and literally everyone on the team ate 4 bananas in a row because he wanted us to sample, and it was pretty painful, but then we ended up having a great relationship with him, and you can't do that unless you're in person. When
you're actually on the line, set your own QA. And what I mean by that is you should watch, if you can, watch their other production runs. And then especially for the first run, you either put your own guy on there, send him or her out there, get him a business hotel for 7 to 14 days in the crappy part of industrial Asia. And they need to be on the line before the workers get there and after the workers get there. Because again, hopefully it's not malice, but there's often negligence where the torque wrenches have been dropped, and so you're not hitting the right torque. And so you need someone on the line doing the QA until you either trust them enough or they fear you enough that they'll hit the production spec every time. That's where the good cop, bad cop routine comes in handy, and Kane's a very good cop. Ask for your certifications. I know the Quirky presentation talked about various FCC certifications, but if you're building mechanical parts, there's probably dozens of specs that your individual components are hitting. The certifications are useful for 2 reasons. One, it shows the supplier, again, that you're paying attention. And if they're willing to fake a certification to get away with something, you got much bigger problems. But secondly, it covers your own ass, where if something in the future happens, hopefully, God forbid, an accident occurs with your product, you're able to point to the certification and then follow that paper trail back. But the moment something happens, you need to instantly be able to pull up the paperwork and say, here's what it was supposed to do, now how do I start an investigation? And I literally mean get the paper copies, not just like a verbal confirmation. And always get production samples. You'll go through dozens of prototypes. Literally my apartment right now, my roommate's here actually, my apartment is a bike storage unit. There's 10 bikes in my very small Manhattan apartment. But you have to be very, very, very sure you're getting a production sample. And what I mean is they're running the line as if they were in production. Because if you're just getting prototypes, they're going to put extra care in, they're going to put the best mechanics or electronic engineers on it. And you really want a representative sample of the line running at full speed. Because once that line's up to speed, you'll find the bottlenecks. And in our cases, it was the guy checking the brakes. That's a pretty big deal on a bike. So run the line at speed and make sure you know all the real bottlenecks.
Yeah, and just because the pieces, you can't think through all the different combinations and things that might go wrong. And we made the mistake of one of our first small batches where it was a known but small change. We're like, just do it and approve it. Didn't fit. Just didn't fit because there was something that they didn't think about. There are also cosmetic things like our logo placement. Looked great on a schematic. When the first second we both saw the bike, we're like, that's wrong. Like that's just not where it should have been. And it was just obvious in person, and it wasn't on paper.
And something that Quirky also talked about, but bring your own internet. So we actually travel with both an access point and a range extender. And if we need to, we're prepared to just drop a fair amount of money on 4G access. The internet in a lot of suppliers' facilities is just atrocious. And if you have to communicate with your stateside team or check Facebook or just kind of anything really, you want your own internet. Something that we were able to actually do is convince the supplier to buy better equipment, and then we did some IT work for them.
Yeah, so over-investing in the early runs. We got a small batch, we distribute it to friends and family. Watching people use your product is amazing, amazingly helpful. Simple things like we had instructions to unpack the bike, like grab the front tire, grab the rear tire, 50-50 toss-up. Like people just did not know which was the front or the rear. So we're labeling the bike. You can't get it wrong. Like we're over-labeling, we're overpacking, and we're not cost engineering. We're cost engineering on the big things, so things that could save you integer dollars or tens of dollars. But when it comes down to quarters or smaller, you don't want your first product to not be amazing because you cut corners. We want to live, personally, we want to live to cost optimize later, and so we're investing in the experience. And when we get scale and we're established, we can get the margins where we need them to be.
So that's a good segue into cost engineering is a tempting and slippery slope. You'll find dozens of places where you can shave off nickels and quarters, and it'll add up, and it's very tempting. And individually, those changes probably don't affect your product very much. But in aggregate, if you are lopping off a nickel 20 times, you end up with a product that's actually feels a lot different than what you started out trying to engineer. So once you start the cost engineering process, it's not going to feel like you're doing much, but as much as you can, get those production samples every step of the way and have a hardcore product guy that wants to spend an infinity amount of dollars to balance out the cost engineering process. We're actually very fortunate in that our bike designer used to be a custom hand builder, so he sold $12,000 bikes. We are dropping that by 2 orders of magnitude, and having him kind of bang his head against the table anytime we make a decision is a really good sanity check.
Yeah, and I think as anyone in the room knows, it's a race to the bottom in terms of just hardware cost. And so that's a dangerous slope. I would think more about how do we create a product that commands a premium? How do we create a great experience? How do we, and I think this may be the next slide, which is how do we invest where people care and not where maybe the manufacturer cares, because they'll try to heavily influence you. So on that last point, we were talking about the box, we were talking about labeling. To a bicycle maker, that makes absolutely no sense. They want thinner tubes, lighter components, thinner tires, but that's not what our customer wants, so we have to always push back and maintain the perspective of who defines the value, and it's just not the manufacturer. Understanding your payment terms is pretty helpful early. So some people want, when you're early, they're going to want you to prepay, so you're going to have that working capital, you're going to do a Kickstarter or something like that. Sometimes you'll pay FOB, which is when it gets on the boat and you take legal ownership. Sometimes you'll pay when it lands in the US. Sometimes you can work out 30-day payment terms. Understanding that's going to massively affect how much you can afford, when you can buy, what your cash cycle is. Then it's better to have that conversation early. If you earn your supplier's trust, they usually can extend you some form of credit. It's either directly through that balance sheet. A lot of the Asian manufacturing countries have economic development loans that I think my understanding is basically from the government to the banks to the supplier to you, and it's actually pretty affordable credit, but you have to get them to step up and essentially guarantee the goods.
And yeah, nothing makes the conversation more awkward than realizing someone owes someone else money and the other person didn't know. With manufacturers, especially small manufacturers, you guys will often enter design and sampling and prototyping phases with basically only handshakes and word of mouth, which is good if you end up working with that supplier, but could be awkward if you end up either not working with that supplier or they've done work that you thought was free that turns out not to be free. So just don't assume that anything is being done for free. The moment they're providing goods or services, find a way to ask if they expect you to pay for that. And as Adam said, lunches and beers are pretty good for that. So that's our first container going out with our over-engineered boxes, and as they were pulling up the ramp, it turns out they hadn't secured the container door. And literally 20 minutes before when they were packing, I was like, man, I've been here for 72 hours living in this factory. I'm just gonna go home, they're ready to ship. It's a good thing I stayed because we caught that. So your work, especially if you're on QA, is never done. Every step of the way, someone will screw up. Even if it's something obvious and small. So don't ever get complacent early on with any step of the supply chain, and I can't emphasize the any step enough.
Yeah. And I think we have a good habit where we kind of go in cycles where we'll spend a bit of a phase being aggressive and being forward-thinking and doing new things, and then we'll spend a phase just being like, what risks are there that could kill us right now? So that's all we're focused on is identifying risk and eliminating it, and I think that's a pretty healthy cycle.
So that's the presentation. The goal was to instill a healthy sense of paranoia in anyone trying to go from zero to small scale, and we're open to any questions.
A lot in a very compressed period of time. Some questions this morning.
For your space, Peter Thiel says in 0 to 1 that you have to go and do something which is fundamentally changing something or producing good productivity in the space that you're offering your product or service in. So could you describe a bit more about what exactly you're offering in terms of that kind of paradigm shift?
Yeah, if I understood the question correctly, you're asking what we're offering that's differentiating us from traditional bike brands. Is that correct? Yep. So if we go back to these very high-level diagrams, what we're bringing to the bicycle industry is just a much more rapid iteration on product design and higher resolution product design cycles. And in the process, we're cutting out a lot of fat in both time and capital from the middle and parties that only exist now to de-risk parties upstream. And we're able to do this because of software services like Flexport, which manages a lot of our custom system, and our ERMs and our CRMs and ERPs. And by starting from zero and applying all these traditionally like software enterprise stack services to a very old, inefficient industry, we're basically removing a lot of the capital risk from the supply chain, and that gets passed back both to our manufacturer working in that nicer, sustainably powered facility, and also to the consumer, where we can cut a lot of the prices, we can cut a lot of the margin that would otherwise go to these parties in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair. I mean, I think Peter Thiel would hate this business. I mean, it's competitive. There's relatively low barriers to entry. I mean, I think at the end of the day, all those things turn into a brand, which is basically people have a preference for paying you money for over like some other service that's approximately similar on the outside.
Great. There was another one right here.
Yeah, you used the quaint term paper trail, and I was wondering how much real physical paper do you actually use, and do you keep the paper, or do you put it in PDFs, and then how do you manage all the documents, the PDFs? Do you have filing cabinets, or?
No, it's all digital. I mean, you'll get some paper and then we'll scan it, and I have a box that I'll put the physical copies in, but it's, after a year and a half, it's this big. It's all digital, but pretty obsessively documented.
All right, thank you very much. Really appreciate you guys being here. It's awesome.